Good morning. My name is Michael Seidl. I'm a member of the Alcor Board of Directors, an attorney, not an attorney practicing in a field that has any bearing on what I'm going to be talking about today. So please make allowances for that. To my right, Rudi Hoffman, insurance agent extraordinaire, and the source of the policies for many of your suspensions. And to my left, Ralph Merkle, who I think probably needs no introduction. So without more, Rudi. Just by way of summary, so you kind of know what to expect this morning, I realize this is the last panel before lunch. If you want to slip out for an extended lounge by the pool before, what the form this morning is going to be, Rudi's going to talk a bit, Ralph's going to talk a bit, I'm going to talk a bit, we're going to talk a bit as a panel, and then we'll let you ask some questions as well.
We do want to make sure we have time for questions in this event. We do want to make this a little more participatory if we can. At the same time, in my 5 to 7 minutes, I got 45 minutes of stuff and 14 comments and powerful, very, very important items that I have them in my heart that, quite frankly, you must get. So we're going to go to work right away. First of all, a quick, could those of you who happen to be friends and clients, would you mind me giving a quick stand? Stand, or, oh, look at that. Oh, hallelujah. Thank you. I see those hands. Thank you. Some of the greatest clients in the world. We appreciate you so much. Okay. I also want to acknowledge my wonderful wife, Dawn, who is her very first Alcor conference. And for any of the rest of you, for your first conference, anybody else who's your first conference here? Oh my goodness, this is not just preaching to the choir here. We're going to preach to the non-choir. And part of our mission here, management by objective. Management by objective in the next 5 to 7 minutes is that you understand the financing of cryonics, the basics of that, and then also moving forward, what will be the funding of cryonics in the future. That's the purpose. Here's a quick summary. We're going to cover the basics of the cryonics funding process, the current costs, the quick thing on the rule of 72. What we want to do is talk about as much certainty as possible. We know there's uncertainty. The scientific presentations deal with all the uncertain elements. Have your brain turning to soup and bad if you don't get good timely presentations. We're going to try to deal with as much certainty as possible in the financial realm. Quick bit on types of insurance, term versus permanent, optimal examples of ideal cryonics funding, and what extra coverage can do for you, and the robustness of your funding. So that's a lot of data. Let's start this. One of the reasons why, let's talk about 2 major items that you should be utilizing when you're talking to people about why this idea makes sense for you personally, perhaps, and also possibly for them. I would like to talk to you about having 2 points. One, we have a new protocol that involves vitrification. We heard about that, and we'll continue to. The second, and while it's technically not new, I think it makes sense to market it as new, is we can now fund this procedure and the costs through the magic leverage of life insurance, enabling access and enabling democratization, and mean that people who are not necessarily, this is not just the bailiwick of the mega wealthy. This is not something that merely rich people engage in who are completely disparate from the vast majority of human beings. If we do not make sure that people understand that cryonics is not only scientifically valid, but more importantly affordable, the pushback, the blowback by the mainstream society is inevitable. I think we should not underestimate people's ability to be incredibly envious, to be incredibly resentful against folks who have some different opportunities. So tell them, 1, we got vitrification. 2, this is affordable through life insurance. How cool is that? 2 quick points. Cost currently. You probably know Alcor's current full-body vitrification protocol is $200,000 suggested minimum. The neurovitrification is, let's hear it? 80, thank you. That is the current numbers on the ground right now. For the last 2.5 years or so, many of you know the Alcor board has been wrestling with a reality called inflation. And we don't have time to go into the whole thing here, but there's been a great deal of hand-waving, is how can we deal with the reality that through technological enhancements and inflation, the actual price points have been, and will almost certainly continue to go up, without throwing the existing pioneers, including those of many of you in this group, who have been happily and quietly supporting Cryonics, paying their dues, making your contributions by being around and being a pioneer. So rather than throwing the pioneers under the bus, what the Alcor board is doing is, we still are, quite frankly, I'm not on the board, but I'm sure those questions will come up. Are the costs going up? The answer is, in my opinion, I think probably yes. How much? That's up in the air for right now, but let me just give you a quick sense of why we must have some type of inflation-adjusted coverage. A quick idea about how long it takes cost to double. Maybe you know this, a fabulous rule of 72. This got me in the investment and insurance business 34 years ago, by the way. Guy shared this idea with me. I said, man, is that cool? And it wound up changing my life. Here it is. An interest rate or an inflation rate taken into the number 72 gives the doubling period of costs. $200,000 today for full-body state-of-the-art cryopreservation with Alcor. If inflation were average, say 6%, 6 into 72 is 12 times. 12 years from now, it's 400,000. 12 years from then, it's 800,000. What's the next iteration? 1.6 million. That's a wee scary. It's a wee scary to try to figure out how to fund for that. That's just the inflation piece, not technological enhancements. There are some other issues, obviously. We may get economy as a scale. There's some other things. And that's just using a 6%. Historically, Alcor has been at about 3.5, which looks at a doubling time more like 20 years, which means this is not a time to panic. Many of you have gotten a couple of letters, an email from me and a letter from Alcor. We got ladies saying, hey, you ought to take a look at some things. That's the purpose of the letter. It doesn't mean it's time to panic. It simply means that over the next reasonable period of time, 6, 12, 24, 36 months, you need to be reviewing your situation and seeing if it's as optimal as it can be given your individual facts and individual situation. Many of us and many of you have in the past have utilized, there's two basic types of insurance, as you know. Term life insurance is level for a term or period of time. The other basic type, permanent, is typically level for the whole of our lives, or at age 120, or basically a long time. The distinctions in that are non-trivial. And term insurance, by the way, is not a bad thing. Term is not a bad word. Of the $2.35 million life insurance on me, much of it is still in a 30-year term format. And many of us know, obviously, that at the end of the term period, the costs go up. But many of us do not quite understand is to the extent that they go up. And let me give a quick example. It happens to be on the personal policy, and I could have brought it to wave around and throw it, but here it is. $200,000 was one of my original term policy. I thought it would be a 30-year term. I was paying about $468 a year. I took and looked at the renewal, and by the way, if those of you who do have term insurance need to take a look at those renewals, they're in the policy. And do we have a guess as to what, at the end of that term period, that $468 a year goes to? 800, 1,000, 5,000, 64,000. It doesn't go up a wee bit, folks. It goes up a bunch. So here, what's the point is, it's nice to have, if you do have term insurance, which is very important to have, especially if you cannot afford enough coverage of some type of levelized coverage, it's important to make sure it is upgradable to a levelized permanent type coverage, and to do so ideally in the early years when you can still afford to do that. Again, the whole life or universal life is going to cost you more money initially, but that premium is going to lock in. Additionally, the idea eventually is to have a policy that you don't have to pay on continually, and so you can pay the policy up in a period of 7 years, or many of the smart folks in here have engaged in a thing called a single premium, simply repositioning dollars to leverage $30,000 into a paid-up policy for $200,000, or leverage $50,000 into a paid-up policy for $500,000. So a single premium policy eliminates a lot of the risks that might occur, because in later years, our income earning may be down. All the gazillions of dollars we've hoped to have made maybe didn't materialize, or maybe made the gazillions of dollars. Are there any examples of people who have made a lot of money and then not had it over a period of time? Again, even very smart folks have reversals of fortune. Wouldn't it be nice to have at least one piece as solid as possible? So part of my mission here is to literally pound the table. And my friend, I got to do this. We got to have some kind of drama. These presentations have been so impeccably professional. They've been so good. Well, it's time to stop that, folks, because we are going to pound the table with our shoe, because that's what Khrushchev did that got a lot of people's attention. And I'm pounding the table here, folks, to make sure that you get your Cryonics funding as solid as possible. That is, there's no simple one-size-fits-all to do this. Did you see the protocols that Greg Fahey was going through to do a reversible cryopreservation on a single organ? This is complicated stuff, folks. There's nothing that says this is supposed to be easy. That's a single organ. That's not your full body, which has multiple organ systems. The reality is it's complicated, and it's going to take money. And it's going to probably take a lot of money. We don't even know how much it's going to take, but it makes sense that more is better than less. Genius. Do we get this point here? I'm going to leave this shoe up here in case another point comes up I have to pound on. Have I been given the hook yet?
I've got my own shoe.
Okay. Robustness of funding. Robustness of funding is obviously very important. Another downside of term insurance, obviously, which is that if you miss a single payment, the policy can go away and you have to requalify. In contrast, whether it's a cashback term or a universal life or some other type program that has a cash component in it, it is much more robust inherently. And obviously, the more money you have in the policy, the more robust it is, culminating in a single premium policy where there's enough money in there so that you don't have to mess with it ever again. So, in closing for this particular section, I would encourage you to, if you have not signed up for Cryonics, or if you have signed up for Cryonics, if you're my client, if you're not my client, we have tried to streamline this process, and some of you may have been on my rudihoffman.com website, where a few months ago we went in studio and we created three-minute videos. Those three-minute videos are designed to streamline and expedite and automate people's understanding of the Cryonics sign-up process. Let's face it, this is a huge abstract. This is abstracts on top of abstracts, so even very smart people have a hard time getting their heads around this meme set, which is why after 40 years of Alcor being around, there's less than 2,000 signed cryonicists in the entire planet. And folks, I think that's a tragedy. And what I want to do is find a way to structure some programs so that we can have something like mass marketing. It's never going to be totally mass marketed, but it should not also be perceived as elitist and should not be perceived as inaccessible. And so to develop a system to where we can get something like 1,000 signups a month, what we've done is taken the video process. Hopefully will go up on YouTube as well, basically to show people this is what you do. You go to rudihoffman.com, you fill out the website form with your data, and that enables us to get some quotes and options to you. So a bunch of people have come up to me in the hall and say, Rudy, what do we do now? What's happening? And I said, well, I'm going to cover it at my presentation, except we can't. What we do need to do is, so the specific directions as to what to do is, I see that Ms. Hoffman is holding up a magical form that has your basic, if you're interested in a quote or interested in an upgrade or additional on your coverage, if you would get with Dawn and put your data on that quote. If you don't have or if you don't have a chance to do that, get home when you get back, or you can Google Cryonics funding or Cryonics. That will kick you to my website, which also links from the Alcor site, and fill out the quote request form so we can at least get some hard data and options to you. So that closes my presentation, and thank you very much.
Well, before I start my comments, I'd like to say that I think Kim Swosey is very brave, has acted very sensible in very trying circumstances, and has really excellent taste in selecting quotes. And with that, I'd like to discuss the Alcor Model Revocable Asset Preservation Trust. I know that for many years, we've all been wanting to do something when we're cryopreserved to preserve our assets. That's been a subject of some discussion. Before I start, how many people have heard of the Alcor Model Trust and know something about it at this point? How many people have? Okay, so this is something we've been working on for quite a few years, and it's now available. And in fact, you can request a copy of the Alcor Model Trust from Diane Cremains, and she will email it to you, and you can see it. And the idea is pretty simple. In essence, if you want to preserve your assets, you want to put them in a cool, dry place so that when you're cryopreserved, they're somewhere, and when you awaken in the future, you find that not only has Alcor done its duty and revived you and reintegrated you into society, but you also have some of your assets there greeting you so that you wake up with money as well as your life. Then the Alcor Model Revocable Asset Preservation Trust can be of assistance. And the idea is pretty simple. We pretty quickly decided that we couldn't do something that would make all cryonicists happy, cryonicists being a individualistic group of people. So we decided that the best we could do would be to have a model trust, and then each cryonicist would take the model trust and go to their attorney or estate planner and say, here's the starting point. Let's change the stuff that I don't like so that it's more suited to what I want. And we thought that approach should actually work out pretty well, because everyone would make the little changes or the big changes that they wanted to make them comfortable with the result. And that's what we did. The primary purpose was that you've got to have something to start from. If you go to your attorney and say, I'd like to take it with me, the usual response of most attorneys, and we actually tried this ourselves, the usual response of most attorneys is, really? That's interesting. And we didn't have much success, so we decided that not only would we go ahead and try and do something, but inasmuch as what we were going to do was probably going to have to be done by a lot of other folks, we might as well try and line up something that would help everybody else. which is what we did. We finally tracked down an attorney with some experience in writing Cryonics Wealth Preservation Trust, because there actually was an attorney, John Deeden, who had written a few of these things for a couple of wealthy Alcor members, and he agreed, after some discussion and after a bit of fundraising within Alcor, to go ahead and help us write a model wealth preservation trust. And this trust is, pretty good starting point to get something done. You can take it in to your attorney and say, here is a Cryonics Wealth Preservation Trust. Can you help me customize it? And your attorney will look at it and he'll go, this looks pretty professional. Yeah, gosh, looks like someone's done some good work on this. And indeed, someone has. We've done a fair amount of review on this, so we think your attorney will be suitably, after a suitable harumph thing, say, well, we should modify this or that clause to make it properly proper. But basically it's in pretty good shape, so he should be willing to go ahead. It'll probably cost you a couple thousand, depending on your attorney. That's for a vanilla sort of situation. It'll depend on...
collect their fees.
It will cost a bit, but basically you can get something set up. There are a couple of things you'll need to do. I mean, besides having an attorney or an estate planner to customize it, you'll need to have a couple of things. The basic idea is pretty simple. The basic idea is that you take your assets, and upon legal death, they are transferred to a trustee, which would be some sort of financial institution. Now, if you're going to do this, you probably have some assets already with a bank or some sort of financial institution. And one of the first questions people have is, well, who do I get to be a trustee? Well, the simple answer is go to your bank or financial institution and say, have you got a organization, usually an affiliated organization, that will act as a trustee for trusts? And at that point, they usually smile and say, why yes, we do. What did you have in mind? And they will then point you to their trustee or trust department, and you will then find yourself in the maw of a well-oiled machine, which will then set you up. And quite often they will smile and say, for you, we will charge a nominal fee or even no fee to become your successor trustee. And then upon your legal death, they will get their fingers on your money, and then they will look after it, which makes them happy. They take a little cut off the top. We actually used, when we were setting up ours, we used Vanguard. We like them. We have our money there, and they do, if some of you aren't familiar with them, they're the granddaddy of sort of the index funds. And they pride themselves on having very low overhead, and basically they just put everything in index funds and don't bother with any fancy investment strategies. And we thought that was just fine. But whoever it is you like or like to have your assets with, and then they'll do whatever the strategy is that you want to have. And then that's your trustee. And then the other thing you'll need are some trust advisors. The trust advisors, they're 3 people. You appoint 2 of them, and Alcor will appoint 1 when the time becomes necessary. So there are 3 trust advisors, and the trust advisors don't actually handle the money. The trust advisors do other things. The trust advisors, one of their basic tasks is to look after the of the trustee and say, hey, the trustee is doing a fine job, and not worry about them, or gee, the trustee, maybe we should change the trustee. Over long periods of time, the trustee might go out of business, or something might happen, the world might change. So over long periods of time, the trust advisors would have the ability to pick a new trustee and have the assets transferred to the new trustee. But two of the trust advisors are your friends that you appoint, and then the third trust advisor would be initially appointed by Alcor. Of course, over time, this one of the things that Alcor provides is long-term continuity. This wealth preservation trust has the intent of lasting a good long time if necessary. So one of the things that happens is the people you appoint as trust advisors might live decades, but at some point they might no longer be able to carry out that function, at which point Alcor would step up and appoint successor trust advisors as the need arose, thus making sure that there would always be 3 trust advisors. In addition, there are some decisions that can't be made by the trustee. The document is written, the trust is written so that the financial decisions and the financial issues are handled by the trustee. They handle the money. But there are things like, hey, when do you get revived? What happens if there are, decisions about the cryonics end of the situation? And those have to be made by Alcor and the trust advisors, and they are carefully segregated from the trustee because your typical financial institution doesn't want to make decisions about, have you been successfully revived? Have you been, how is the cryopreservation proceeding? Has the cryopreservation reached a point where there's no chance of reviving you? Those decisions are handled strictly by Alcor and the trust advisors. So those decisions are segregated out, and the trustee handles only the financial decisions. So that's the basic outline. I should mention it is a revocable trust, so that if you decide at some point after setting this up, gee, I thought that was a good idea, but it's not. You take the assets out and put them somewhere else. And we made that decision deliberately. When you start talking with trust advisors, some of them will say you should make an irrevocable trust. And indeed, if you have substantial assets and you want to hire the necessary legal talent to make sure your irrevocable trust is done right, then irrevocable trusts can have substantial benefits, but you need to hire the legal talent and do it correctly because they're irrevocable. We did not do that. We decided that a revocable trust would be the right thing to do. If you want to make it irrevocable and are willing to put in the money to make sure you do it right, have at it. And that's sort of the quick outline. It is modeled, in essence, after dynasty trusts, and it is something that, for the most part, it's tried and true, other than the parts we added to deal with the cryonics specific parts. Most trusts don't have a clause in them that say, and by the way, when you are revived from cryopreservation, you get your money back. That's the part that's new and different, and I'm not aware of any sort of legal precedents for that process. So most lawyers will say, gee, that part hasn't been tried before. I'm not sure I can guarantee how courts will treat that process. So we have done our best to have something that looks like it should work and be simple and not be subject to any confusion. However, it has not been done before, and we believe it should work, but we will find out in years to come. So that's the model trust.
Great, thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Rudy. I had one panelist who spoke standing, one panelist who spoke sitting, left with the quandary as to which I should do to look most natural. I'm used to standing when I speak to my judges. You're my judges today, so I think I'll stand. Two caveats up front. I said I was an attorney. I'm going to give some suggestions here. I'm not your attorney. I hope you think they're great. If you do, please take them to your attorney in order to flesh out the practicalities and be sure they work for you. Second point, I am a member of the Alcor board, but I'm not wearing that hat today. I don't speak for the board. And in fact, the board may not agree with some of the things I'm going to say today. So those just two warnings to begin with. I want to spring off the comment that Councilman Littlefeld started with this morning, the idea that becoming an Alcor member is commencing an adventure. And I'd also like to follow Rudy's example of asking you to use your hands for something other than clapping. Can I get a show of hands of how many people in the room are Alcor members? Now, everyone who's been a member for less than a year, please put their hand down. I didn't tell you to put your hands down. Everybody who's been a member for less than a year, please put your hand down. Less than 5 years, please put your hand down. Less than 10 years, please put your hands down. Less than 15? 20? 25? I'm still seeing hands up. 30? 35? I see 135. 40? We are Alcor at 40? Excellent. Thanks to everyone who's been involved for so long. If you didn't get to put your hand up, I hope you will get to put your hand up one day and join that adventure. As a sort of metaphorical example, I would ask you to think about the fact that if you've been engaged in this adventure for more than a year, it's as if you started off on a ship for the new world, provisioned for a journey you didn't know how long was going to be. As you just saw, there's at least one person in the room who's been on that journey for 40 years. Rudy did a great job, I think, speaking to you a bit about planning for the duration of that journey. It may be a very long journey. You should plan and provision accordingly. I'm going to talk about three things just very briefly, and I'm going to tell you what they are, and then I'm going to explain them, and then I'm going to tell you what they are again in the hopes that they'll actually stick. My 3 points that I hope you'll take away today are: 1, protect the noggin; 2, don't give people around you incentive to frustrate your cryopreservation; and 3, give people incentive to help your cryopreservation. 1, my first rule: protect the noggin. Think first about providing for your own cryosuspension. Wealth preservation trust, great. Increased insurance funding, great. Definitely think and plan for the fact that this may be a long journey and costs are going to increase over time. You should plan for whatever mechanism of funding you choose, one that's going to be secure, one that's going to increase in time. Can't depend on the fact that costs are going to stay the same, or that the ship that you set sail on today is still going to be adequately provisioned 5, 10, 15, 20, 40 years from now. So first things first, protect yourself first before you go play the ponies with a wealth preservation trust or other sorts of investments. Just as any kind of financial advisor will say, before you start playing the stock market, be sure you've got a couple months' salary in the bank, be sure you've got health insurance, life insurance, things covered. Be sure you've covered your cryopreservation needs first and foremost. Second point, don't give people around you incentive to frustrate your cryopreservation arrangements. If you're rich and love Alcor and think you'd like to give us all your money, I have just one request of you: don't. Just don't. This may be where one of the other board members jumps up and says, "Oh, well, he's definitely not speaking for me." As I warned you, they might.
You can leave it to us in a bequest, of course.
Everybody.
Or an extra life insurance policy.
everybody's had firsthand experience with what happens when a family member dies and how otherwise seemingly rational people start to squabble over small things. Who's getting that antique drawer? Who's getting the Hummel collection? Who's getting the sentimental waffle iron that grandma made waffles with on Christmas Day? That gets exponentially worse where there's a large liquid estate. It gets even worse in the context of cryonics, where you may have family members who don't support or understand and think the $200,000 whole body suspension that you've provided for is just a glorified funeral that you really shouldn't be entitled to. If you haven't provided for them in your will, in your estate planning, that's really giving them tremendous incentive to try to frustrate your cryopreservation. And in a case where you've left effectively everything to Alcor, a terribly bad idea because there's even greater incentive. I'm going to give you two examples from recent Alcor history. And the facts are accurate, but I'm going to gloss over some of the facts to protect confidentiality issues and issues that arose in the context of settlement. In one case recently, we had a member who joined in 2004, prepaid $70,000 membership fees, but as a number of you may have, provided for in his agreement that if he couldn't be chronically suspended, those funds would revert to his family. Well, his family knew about his arrangements. He passed away. His family neglected to contact Alcor, had him buried, and then contacted Alcor and said, hey, can't be cryopreserved, we'd like our money now. Alcor fought that, and Alcor prevailed, but it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory given the delays in the suspension. So one point, the point you should take from that is the idea that you don't want to create an incentive for family members, even by silence, to frustrate your cryopreservation. Second example from recent memory, very wealthy individual commenced his Alcor arrangements, completed a will, hadn't completed his Alcor arrangements, passed away, executor with power of attorney proceeded with his cryo suspension, that's great, but he had left everything to Alcor. There was an estranged family member, very upset at the fact that she had cared for him during his final years, although he lived separately, challenged the will. We went through several years of legal proceedings, which culminated in a mediation and settlement whereby Alcor ended up agreeing to take half. Now, there were infirmities in the will, there were other problems that led to that conclusion, but again, the point there is, in that case, more would have been less, or rather less would have been more. If he hadn't tried to give us everything, we probably would have gotten what he did want to give us, and we certainly would have got it a lot sooner. So please don't, through your financial arrangements, contingent beneficiaries under your insurance policies, or your agreement that says what happens if you can't be cryopreserved, create incentive for other parties to frustrate your cryopreservation. Third, and briefest point, should be the most obvious, give people incentive to support your cryopreservation. A couple of things you might want to consider in your will: have a specific bequest to the family member or individual who first contacts Alcor to advise them of your final illness or death. Provide expressly in your will that if an individual who's otherwise entitled to something interferes with or frustrates your cryopreservation, that they're not going to take anything. That'd be comparable to a no contest provision, which is very common, in which you provide in your will that if somebody contests the will, they're not going to take anything under the will. Provide expressly for everyone close to you. Even if it's a nominal sum, you're a whole lot better off if there's a challenge, having provided for everyone. So at least they're identified in the will. In the example I gave you of the wealthy member, although he was estranged from this family member and had said to his attorney he didn't want to leave anything to her, wasn't in the will, which then created additional problems. And finally, as I already said, please, if you've structured your planning in such a way that anything might revert if you can't be cryopreserved. Think about changing and addressing that now. So my 3 points, everyone knows them now: protect the noggin, don't give people incentive to frustrate, and give people incentive to help. Thanks.
We'll be taking questions. Is this mic on? Maybe if you could go to the mics that are in the halls here.
Ralph, how does the Alcor Model Trust get around the rule against perpetuities?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, could you repeat the question? How has the Alcor Model Trust been around the world?
How does the Alcor Model Trust get around the rule against perpetuities?
Rule against perpetuities. So the Alcor Model Trust has as its jurisdiction the state of Delaware, and the state of Delaware has no law against perpetuities. And in fact, we've been seeing an increase in the number of states in the United States that are abolishing the law against perpetuities. So there are more and more states that have no prohibition against perpetuities. So that seems to be an increasing trend, and as a consequence, we can do that, and it's becoming increasingly less of a concern. There are a number of states that have restrictions that are in the hundreds of years, and some people have chosen to do that on the assumption.
Florida is life and being plus 360, by the way.
It's a state-dependent thing.
The perpetuity issue is probably the least of the concerns, but there's others. Yes.
But no law against, basically Delaware is very nice that way. Delaware is very flexible.
This is Bill Falloon. I just want to make a comment about the virtues of irrevocable trusts. Unfortunately, as we grow older, and we found this historically, people start to change their mind. They sometimes decide they no longer want to be cryopreserved, or they want to take those assets that they were so determined to leave to a revival trust and use them elsewhere. So there is a virtue to placing funds into an irrevocable trust. It does involve more attorney's fees, but what I've personally done with virtually everything is make it irrevocable. I don't want there to be an opportunity sometime in the future for any change in the direction of where funds go. There are also some estate tax advantages if you properly set up an irrevocable trust as opposed to a revocable one. So I just wanted to put that information before the group, that there are some virtues to irrevocable arrangements that are hard to conceive of right now. But I personally know a lot of very dedicated individuals who were not cryopreserved because of senility and stroke issues, Alzheimer's, problems that occurred later in life that they just couldn't conceive of when they made the arrangements.
Yeah, I think the irrevocable trusts are advantageous, and the basic rule of thumb is if you really know what you're doing and you've really thought it out, then yes, the irrevocable trusts are advantageous. You better make sure you know what you're doing, you better make sure you've thought it out, and you better make sure that your attorneys know what they're doing, because they're irrevocable.
One way to think of that as well might be just as you don't want to give others incentive to frustrate your cryopreservation, you may not want to give yourself incentive to frustrate your cryopreservation. If you can get at those assets, there may come a time where you would think it'd be a good idea to do so, when in fact that might not really be in your best interest.
And I would also add that these trusts can also be funded with additional life insurance, which once again provides additional leverage. The distinction being, and it goes to your point, Michael, instead of having the assets go to your trust instead of going to your family, the life insurance or a second to die life insurance in some cases, and many of you in this room have already done something similar to this. So these large lump sums are created in addition to the dollars to fund that trust, and therefore are less likely to be causing a problem with the balance of your family.
Any other questions? I've got a question for Ralph. Ralph, isn't it true that wealth preservation trusts are only for the very wealthy?
Gosh, I'm glad you asked that question. No, indeed, they're not only for the very wealthy. Why, wealth preservation trust can be set up for only $1,000 or $2,000, and we are thinking even now of how to reduce the costs further. And at some point in the future, we expect that we will somehow manage to reduce the costs by setting up cookie-cutter trusts that you can have any trust you want as long as it's black, to paraphrase Henry Ford. But basically the idea is that, yeah, you can have trusts that are relatively inexpensive. If you take the basic trust and don't make many modifications to it, you should be able to shop around and get an attorney who will customize it without too much cost. And as I said, we're continuing to work on finding a trustee who will take a very vanilla trust and accept it without charging too much.
I want to thank Ralph for the work he and his folks have done on this trust. We've gone through several, obviously, how many iterations were involved, Ralph?
Well, we're up to version 18, and that's there were a lot of sort of preliminary versions and discussions.
The previous conference to this, and the previous conference to that, I believe, one of the big unveilings was supposed to be this magical trust. But guess what? It did not get unveiled, the previous one. It did not get unveiled the 5-year ago one, but it is being unveiled here. So it is a real deal. It is available for the low, low price, I believe, of
free. Yeah.
Which some of us can afford.
Yes. You also neglected to mention the previous efforts that bombed before we got this effort underway and managed to pull it off.
We persisted. You persisted
Yeah.
until you succeeded. That's
Yep.
the motto. Additional questions out there? Oh, thank you.
Okay.
We got 1 minute.
I think it's
hey,
red. It means
You're the last chance in the entire world to ask questions of this august panel.
I got one. Rudy,
Yes.
the trust, is that looked at as a preservation of assets or actually like seed money for something 200, 300, 400 years hence?
it is a trust. It is a legally separate pot of money, and that trust does whatever the trust document specifies that it does. It happens to specify in the trust document that when Alcor revives you, that the trustee, upon receipt of the appropriate notification from Alcor and the trust advisors, that the trustee will hand the money over to you when you're revived. So it is simply a trust.
Additionally, if I can, there's an important point on that. Because of the structure of the dynasty trust, there is no law required, new law to determine whether an individual in cryostasis has rights or is an individual. Because of the nature of the dynasty trust, it kind of does a workaround around that concept, which is very important.
There's no requirement that the future decide that you are you or anything like that. It's simply Alcor revives you, and when Alcor sends a letter to the trustee and says, this here person who's shown up on your doorstep is the revived you, hand him the money, that's it. The trustee has a letter in hand from Alcor saying this person is the revived you, and the trustee in receipt of the letter says, okay, you on the doorstep that Alcor says is the revived person, you get the money. Compound interest.
Yeah, obviously the trustees are advised and to generate a real rate of return, i.e. return after inflation and taxes.
Yeah.
How's our time coming? Your call.
Walking sternly across the
40.
floor was not noticed, so I'm going to have to call this session to an end. If you'd hang about for just another 3 minutes, I know we're late for lunch, but we have a very short intro. It'll just be 3 minutes. If you could please hang about before. But thank you for the panel, for a very informative discussion.